everybody, this is Hero from the Birds back with another Shadowlands video, and in this video I'd like to talk about all of the DPS classes going into 9.1 and their scaling specifically for raid encounters. So we're talking about PvE and we're talking about all of the DPS classes, and I have a long chart that I'd like to work through and speak to you a little bit about what it means that a class scales as an expansion goes on, which classes scale, and why it's significant that we think about these things. In the background here, we just have some enhancement shenanigans going on. And before we get to the chart, I'd just like to make a few caveats. The first is that when we're talking about world first raiding and the needs of raiders, there's a couple of important things related to scaling that are useful for us to keep in mind. The first one is that there are a limited number of DPS spots in a 20-man raid. Generally speaking, we have something like 4 or 5 healers and 2 tanks. That's 6 or 7 bodies already taken up. And that leaves only something like 13 souls. Yeah, most have a serious world first raiding tax associated with them, which means that there are something like 13 DPS specs available as melee, and not all of them are equal in the value that they provide to a world first raid. And the purpose of a world first raid is to crush the content as quickly as possible, and so leaders of those guilds are trying to look at the specs from a perspective of what they offer to the whole group, what their special niche is, and if it's valuable, especially on the last couple of bosses. And melee, though they're probably okay in general as far as the comparison between how hard it is to play in a raid setting versus ranged, they struggle with this problem of having so many other choices that you could bring. And range is the same kind of work without the limitation of being in melee range. So we're looking, generally speaking, at melee classes that bring a significant buff. So when we're talking about issue of scaling, we want to keep in mind some of these other factors make a specific reasonable or worth bringing. So let me take a look at the moment at the document that I'd like to show you. I'm going to work through each of the DPS specs, and then we'll talk about some of the viability for their different burst, single target, AoE, or cleave abilities. Here we have the basic chart. On the left we have all of the DPS specs, and then we have the secondary stats across the top here. Crit, haste, mastery rating value, which is taken from the website that basically shows us how each individual point of rating increases each class's mastery, given that mastery is a different kind of scaling than crit, haste, or versatility. And I've also included in this row the base amount of mastery that each spec gets from having 0 rating. We'll talk about how each of the different effects scales, and then give you on the right side here an indication of which specs I anticipate will scale well, the green being a really high ability to scale in different kinds of DPS requirements, and yellow being a significant note. If your favorite spec doesn't show up here on the right side being marked off either as significantly good or exceptional, don't worry. Obviously this is just my opinion, but it's based largely on our evaluation of the kinds of secondary stat scaling that we can expect going forward in the expansion. So that's why it's here. As I go through each spec, I'll also make comments about its utility for raiding in correspondence with my earlier comments I just made about the needs of specifically world first raiders. Some of the other things to note before we start: I have here an evaluation in the mastery column of how much of the damage from a DPS spec is associated with the mastery, and this is a really important thing for understanding why mastery scales well and what it doesn't. And finally, just a note on the diminishing returns that are in effect for Shadowlands. This is a somewhat new feature, but there is a kind of tax bracket style diminishing returns that Blizzard has input into the game, meaning that you are taxed beyond the 30 percentile for whatever remaining secondary stat you receive past that number at a rate of, say, 10%. And then if you go past the next bracket, it's at 20%, and so on and so forth. This is actually a fairly reasonable form of diminishing returns, meaning it probably won't impact you that much, and certainly not for the Chains of Devastation raid will anybody be pushing the kind of raiding that's going to be massively influenced by diminishing returns. But the one thing I want to note is that all diminishing returns are based on the rating rather than the percentage, meaning especially when it comes to mastery, if you have a high base percentage of mastery, like we have, as you can see here with Frost DKs at 16%, that's a lot of mastery for 0 rating. The diminishing return doesn't come in at 16%, it comes in at whatever number of rating that you have. It's something like, I don't know, 1054 or something like that. And you can see here that within the rating value, every 17 points of rating is going to grant you another 1% of mastery as far as Frost is concerned. What this means is that in general, any class that has a really high base level percentage is going to value that stat. And I've marked these things out by giving you a kind of red marker to indicate specs where the mastery is quite significant as far as the scaling is concerned, just in general, regardless of how a class uses it. And then this little yellowish golden mark here to note classes that have pretty solid scaling from mastery. The rogue, when we get to them, I'll talk about. This blue marker is essentially an indication that the value of mastery is so low for that spec that regardless of how good the scaling is, it's still kind of a problem. Okay, so again, the point is to be kind of a little bit mathematical and tie these things to each of the specs. I've gone through and compared a lot of 95th percentiles across individual bosses within Castle Nathria, which is probably one of the better ways to go about thinking about your class and its scaling. And so on the right side, we have things like single target, cleave, AoE, and burst. All of this has been measured against different encounters, and I've sort of done my homework to think through what individual players are doing. I've watched replays of Warcraft logs and watched when the burst windows occur and what kinds of things are being stacked together to make for such amazing abilities. I've looked at the influence of covenants and legendaries and tried to factor them in whenever I think they're an important factor. All of this to try to bring you a reasonable discussion of how Shadowlands DPS scaling works. So let's get going. The DKs, obviously, DKs have been pretty valuable for World First rating because of the return of AMZ specifically, and obviously the DPS of Unholy has been quite strong in single target scenarios. So they both share that, and they are, generally speaking, a raid spot in almost every instance where you need another raid cooldown. They provide it, and so that's pretty unique. They are tied a little bit to Blood DK for that utility, so if a Blood DK is really a valuable or important part of your raid, you might find that Frost or Unholy are maybe a little bit less useful. But when we start by looking at scaling, Frost DKs have probably the most unique scaling element of all of the DPS specs. And that's because Killing Machine is scaled across each of the secondary stats. And I'll begin with crit. Obviously, Killing Machine is an ability that, or a passive, I should say, excuse me, where your auto attack critical strikes have a chance to change the function of one of your most important damaging abilities, Obliteration. And I say change the function because it's going to enhance it, and it's going to change it into frost damage, which is buffed by our mastery. So that means that critical strikes, specifically the critical strikes that give us the Killing Machine proc, and haste, which is going to influence how often we have access to this Killing Machine proc, and mastery are all in play when we talk about the scaling of Obliteration. And it's especially important because the mastery makes up something like 70 to 90% of the damage we do is influenced by our mastery. In addition to this, we have Runic Empowerment, that it has a direct correlation with haste, as well as Pillar of Frost. And finally, Breath of Cindergrosa, which is a notable talent for Frost DKs, also is heavily influenced by the amount of mastery that we have, because it is directly correlated as a Frost damage ability. So it's also noted here. Our mastery rating value is quite solid as a Frost DK. We get a lot of base value from having no rating at all, and there's a fairly low number, 17.51 rating required for every 1 percentage point. given how powerful Mastery is as a scaling modifier for Frost DKs, that makes this a fairly important piece of secondary stat scaling. I think Frost DK, of all of the specs that I've looked at for DPS, is the only spec that has a universal scaling element, Mastery, Crit, and Haste, all working together, which is going to make versatility sort of a low value ability, a low value stat. Now, I should say what I mean by low value is not that having versatility is bad, but just that we really don't mind having more crit and more haste and more mastery, which means when we're gearing, since gear only has 2 secondary stats, generally speaking, across the board, it's not a bad thing to have any of these 3. This puts Frost, I think, on the whole as one of the best potential scaling specs in the entire game for DPS. So if you're a world first raiding group, maybe you don't actually want Frost because its damage profile is not really what you're looking for, but for the rest of the world, Frost is in a position to scale with secondary stats exceptionally well. Unholy DK has no specific crit scaling modifiers. It does have Runic Corruption, Sudden Doom, which are tied to haste, meaning the more haste we have, the more valuable these things are. And it also, like Frost, has a significant mastery scaling element, 70 to 90%, because it's tied to shadow damage and minions. And the rating value is quite reasonable. It's very easy to pick up quite a lot of mastery on your gear without hitting DR. So Unholy is also in a really good spot. And if you look at some of the logs, if you check out something like, I don't know, Shriekwing or Zymox or I guess Sledgefist is a really kind of awkward situation because there's damage amps there. But anything that's kind of just straight single target Unholy is going to do exceptionally well. So I have it marked off here as scaling very well in single target going forward. Havoc DH is the first example we have of a kind of unique scaling spec, and I'm going to walk you through it. In some places, I've marked out in red letters where a spec scales kind of negatively with a secondary stat. And here, the reason for this is that I-Beam automatically critically strikes, so any kind of additional critical strike that you gain is not going to affect that one ability, since I-Beam is such a significant portion of our damage overall. It is unfortunate that the extra crit is not being made use of by this ability. This is further compounded by the fact that a lot of the abilities that Havoc Demon Hunters are using involve either reducing the CDR of I-Beam, resetting it, as with Dark Glare Boon, or giving us resources related to it. So unfortunately, crit is one of those what we call a dead stat, and that just means that there's a significant portion of critical strike that is not scaling the damage profile of your character. That said, haste is a significant scaling point, as you can see here, for the same reasons I just mentioned, especially RNG I-Beam resets, which is massive potential. And this is one thing that you should always check for. Does a spec have any sort of secondary stat that is associated with RNG resets? If it does, and there's a couple of examples that we'll talk about going on, then this stat has a lot of power, so that you get far more bang from your buck, because you may have an opportunity, due to the way RPPM works, to reset, in this case, I-Beam, and therefore get a lot more damage. It does make your damage profile a little wonky because you have high ceilings and maybe you have low lows, so you have some pulls where things don't work very well. But overall, especially if you're scaling this off of haste, you can expect good results from stacking this secondary stat. So there's some really good things to look forward to for Havoc. Just because you have a dead stat in crit, quote unquote, doesn't mean that haste is not also valuable. And part of the reason you'll see this going forward, we have marked off versatility as having a high value, and this is, I've marked it in green for all the specs you can see here, where there is a deflation based on the value of other secondary stats. And this is a common feature across the board, that whenever versatility is good, largely that means a spec doesn't necessarily scale very well throughout the expansion. And this is just because we have essentially 2 stats that aren't that valuable. Mastery is not that valuable because it only buffs our chaos damage, which is something like 50%, maybe 60% of the value of our damage, even though the base rating is decent. One thing as far as world first raiders are concerned, and this has been historically true for Havoc, the access to darkness and a magic debuff is pretty significant. The debuff itself we've often given to Vengeance Demon Hunters, but this is kind of standard fare to have at least somebody playing a Demon Hunter to offer all of your especially ranged damage dealers an extra bonus damage on the boss or the target. And Darkness, like AMZ, is a really awesome raid cooldown. There's some uses for it. AMZ, obviously, going back into the mix, especially for your DPS classes, has really given them a lot more valuable in raids. But I can see Havoc DHs, especially the way they scale with haste, being something that I think a lot of raid leaders are going to look for to help out, because they do bring that raid buff. Okay, balance druids, probably the love child of many new players. Balanced druids are doing tons and tons of work in Castle Nathria for various reasons. Some of it pad, some of it not. They're also awesome in Mythic Plus. And here's the breakdown of their secondary stat scaling. Due to the way that Lunar Eclipse works and the balance of all things legendary, your crit stat is a kind of detriment to you overall. We get so much crit from these two pieces. Balance of all things actually used to be 40% crit amp whenever we are in our eclipses, meaning in those burst windows, critical strike is basically accounted for. You're hitting something like 60% crit very reasonably each time without any secondary stat needed. So that really deflates the value of critical strike for balanced druids already. Historically, specs that have such amazing access to secondary stat amps at the beginning of the expansion end up falling off near the end of the expansion, because other specs that don't really have a ton of these amplifications just gain a whole bunch of other raw stats, and it brings up their value. So my prediction for balance, just based on this, if they don't nerf balance of all things again or change the way Lunar Eclipse works, it may be a similar story. Also, a lot of their damage is potentially pad depending on the fight type. But this is compounded by another issue, which is that balanced druids, especially Night Fae balanced druids, have kind of anti-synergy with haste. This is due to the way the Convoke spell works. It is unhasted, meaning the 4-second channel time is locked in, and you cannot, reduce it with haste. And since this is a significant amount of their damage profile, bursting out huge Celestial Alignment Convokes into a single target, a lot of this damage diminishes the value of your haste. You couple this together with the fact that our mastery value is one of the best in the game, meaning because it looks like 9% here as a base, but you have to remember that Celestial Alignment is double dipping because we get both the lunar and the solar portion, so that makes it 18% base without any rating, plus a fairly reasonable 31 to 1%, given the fact that we can double dip it each time. Means that we have a ton of value in mastery. 80% of our damage comes from our eclipses, and we can pour all of it through Convoke into a specific window. That makes mastery amazing, and it's also the reason why crit and haste are deflated, making versatility your other main stat for balanced druids. On the whole, this means that balanced druid is going to be probably fairly good for the beginning of Chains of Devastation, but I think probably by the end of this tier, or maybe the end of or the beginning of the next tier, they will likely fall off as damage dealers unless something else significant changes. Obviously, guys, with the 9.1 PTR, there's lots more stuff going on, but the trend in the way the development cycle works is that we tend to add on rather than to take away these special kinds of modifiers. So it's likely that you will see within the bottom of your soulbind trees, significant boosts to things like crit and haste. And if you look at, I think, Venthyr right now, if the Nadia tree is a good example of this, you get a haste buff every 1 minute, and then at the bottom of the tree, once you get enough renown, you'll get a secondary stat for another 10 seconds after that one fades. So it's kind of doubling up on the value of big percentage amps to your secondary stats, and balance is just not going to be able to make use of some of those portions going forward unless something else changes. It doesn't mean they're bad. I think they're still going to have exceptionally good cleave scaling because their dots are still quite strong. and they can funnel a little bit, and also just their on-demand burst is off the charts. It's right up there with your fire mages and your at the moment Affliction Warlock. So I think Affliction's going to be changing a little bit, and those sorts of things. So there's lots of value for balanced druids going forward. It's just the fact that they really only offer a world first raid a damage profile that is intense and perhaps kind of on the broken side. That's probably the only reason why balance is being considered. It doesn't provide any specific raid utility that you would want. So you're only stacking them because they are just broken. And I don't anticipate that'll last past this next Chains of Devastation raid. Feral. Okay, kind of a meme spec like Survival, but one thing that Feral has going for it is it scales exceptionally well, even though the playstyle is a little bit problematic. And what I mean by that is if you know how to play Feral or anything about it, it was traditionally one of your big brain specs where you have to think about the scaling of your bleeds and snapshotting and all that kind of stuff. It's the only spec, I believe, that retains any of that with Tiger's Fury, and yet your bleeds are such a small portion of your damage overall that it's kind of frustrating. Thankfully, they changed Mastery to affect Bite as well. Otherwise, they would have had to rejig the entire spec. But one thing that's interesting is they scale fairly well across all stats. Their Mastery, for example, has a good base, and given the fact that it buffs both our bleeds and our bite, we can put that together with Convoke and get quite a lot of value out of Mastery. It's something like 90%, 95% of your damage is coming from those kinds of things. So everything is getting buffed by it, which is awesome. As far as the other two, crit scales are passive, so we have the crit bonus from being a Feral Druid. It also gets scaling from Berserk, and Shred gives you an extra combo point whenever you crit, so there's lots of value there. This is especially important because overall, given the fact that we play Convoke, that is Night Fae, Haste doesn't have quite as much scaling. Obviously, Omen of Clarity is relevant because that's tied to our auto attacks. So we do get some free combo point generation from that. But in general, crit is good scaling. Mastery is good scaling. Versatility, given that we're throwing a lot of our damage into specific bite windows with Tiger's Fury, is also pretty reasonable scaling. In general, this class is set to be a single target monster. It likely just does not have a raid spot in the world first race, and that's largely to do with the lack of utility. That's why the point about balanced druid is so relevant here. If you can't fit a melee spec in because you really need a buff slot, then will you run a druid at all? And balance is just slapping, so the answer for balance was yes. But for Feral, they just don't have that luxury of being at ranged, and that's going to be a problem for them in World First. This class is still going to be exceptional in its scaling across the expansion, specifically due to the nature of their mastery and how it scales. Beast Mastery. Beastmaster Hunter is one of those bizarre specs that has a really smooth damage profile. It's like Frost Mage, and sometimes we look at these specs and we think, Beastmaster Hunter is for the new players. It's such a boring and simple rotation, and that's true. It's just so much easier to see how a secondary scaling with trinket uses in a burst scenario makes a class overpowered. The best example of this is going to be Fire Mage, which I'll talk about, but Beast Mastery is in a unique position because it has good mastery scaling, it has significant crit and haste interactions, and yet it doesn't look like it'll scale that well overall. Probably just mediocre amounts over the course of a fight, and it'll be very much fight dependent on whether your beasts can cleave, or whether the encounter actually needs your hunter abilities or not, whether for it to see a world first rating scenario. But let's go through the scaling and talk about why I mean that. So Wild Call, which is barbed shot reduction, Rylax Legendary, which is your pet crit, though it's not necessarily the most popular one, it's still used to some degree. These all scale with crit, so there's some value in our critical strike. Bestial Wrath's cooldown reduction is also associated with Barb Shot, so it's kind of like a little bit of a version of Frost DK in that we have one skill, Barbed Shot, associated with scaling in both crit and haste, which is useful. Mastery is somewhat decent as far as the rating value is concerned, but overall damage is quite variable depending on the legendaries you use. Somewhere around 50% of your damage is related to your pets. If it were closer to 90% of your damage, like with Feral Druids, you would see Beastmasters, positioned to scale off the charts. But as such, since the mastery doesn't scale quite as well, it's not that great overall. I don't mean this to say that Beastmaster will be a bad spec. I just mean from the perspective of secondary stat scaling, Beast Mastery doesn't look like it has that much to offer. And this is due to sort of where our damage profile is situated. It has to do with the fact that Mastery doesn't offer us that much scaling. It's kind of like a Demon Hunter. And that traditionally the kinds of fights that Beast Mastery excels at are excelled at even better by other specs. Really falls apart for Beastmaster whenever you have split cleave, especially. So anytime the pets have to move between two targets, or there's some problem with moving across an encounter, if you can't have them in, doing their cleave in melee for the whole fight, you'll find that they fall behind. Beastmaster is still a fine spec, and it does bring an immunity to the raid, but so do the other ones as well. The scaling just isn't quite there. Marksmanship. Crit, we get aim shot, focus scaling here, and this is significant, and I talk about this in the notes as well, because of the way that Marksman has put all of its marbles into one container, aim shot being the focus of the damage in this spec. There's significant reason to value the secondary stat scaling that you get. The mastery of Marksman isn't that great as far as the scaling is concerned, specifically the fact that it requires 56 rating to get 1%. Nevertheless, it affects all of our damage, which is pretty important. Aim shot is solid. It's 247.8% of your attack power, which is one of the highest scaling abilities in the game. This means that it's kind of like Arcane Blast for Arcane Mages. Every time you press the button, if you can make the ability crit, its value goes off the charts. So there is some focused gameplay that makes critical strike almost a scaling piece of the way aim shot works. But actual specific scaling, we get aim shot cooldown reduction from haste, and then we do have some pure aim shot scaling from Master Marksman, Careful Aim, Double Tap, and Lock and Load, which are all talents. And the fact that you have that much synergy within the talent tree itself means that this spec, because there's no significant detractions, it looks like it will scale fairly well with secondary stats just in general, although it does not have, and this is an important distinction to make, it does not have specific interactions outside of haste that affect scaling. So like the Frost DK is a good example of Killing Machine being a direct correlation between secondary stat increases. I'm just saying that Marksman, because of the base value of aimed shot and how powerful it is and how all of your damage is associated with it, it means that all of these secondary stats are somewhat reasonable. I don't think Marksman is going to really blow anyone out of the water, though. It doesn't seem to have any fights that favor it. Single target might be okay, or as we saw with Denathrius, anytime you need to target swap to a target that's at ranged, it does a little bit better than Beastmaster in that regard, but we'll see. I think it's reasonable to think that Marksman will scale fairly well unless something changes with aim shot. Survival Hunter, another one like Feral Druid that has the problem of being a melee DPS, and it has the following kinds of scaling. Raptor Strike procs from the Rylak Legendary scales with your haste, although the Rylak is not necessarily the most common survival hunter legendary. It still has that kind of scaling. One of the major problems for survival is that the mastery is quite poor as a scaling factor. It's only 20 to 40% of our damage overall. It's the focus spenders of you and your pet, which account for kind of very little amount of your damage. There is therefore a significant amount of value in versatility and critical strike, and I think because of this, Survival Hunter doesn't really have the significant amount of scaling modifiers that will make it that strong. It's going to be, I should say, that strong as a scaling spec. It still probably does actually tons of damage. It just won't be brought because you could bring range specs, beast mastery, or marksmanship if you needed a hunter in a world first race, and it's also competing without a specific raid buff in the melee slot. So that's why it's there. It is notable though that its AoE scaling is actually significantly stronger than maybe most people realize, just due to the way that the spec works with the bombs and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, so for those survival hunters, any major AoE fight is going to be solid for you, and you'll be fine. If you're not a world first raider, this doesn't really matter that much. But there's no specific secondary stat scaling to get excited about. On to the mages. Arcane Mage is one of those specs that has a significant kind of scaling for its mastery. It's a little bit unique because it's broken down into different segments. So 4.8% is the scaling modifier for Arcane Blast. That's per charge. So we're talking about Arcane Blast damage is improved by 20% when you have 4 charges, and that's largely when you're going to be casting your Arcane Blast in significant amounts. It's obviously a burst spec, meaning you're pouring Arcane Blasts and your Arcane Missiles into a specific Arcane Power window. But just so you understand how we're getting this rating scaling and why it's significant, the Blast portion is about 20%. That's how you should read this, is a better way to look at it. For 4 charges. Barrage damage is not irrelevant if you need Execute. Arcane has access to one of the most powerful AoE Execute legendaries, and this is taken even from BFA systems. It's still quite strong. In single target, it's reasonable, but there's still scaling on the mastery side for just Barrage itself. And then otherwise, there's 8%, and this otherwise has been added in for Shadowlands. It did not always used to be that Arcane's mastery increased all damage, but the fact that it does is pretty significant. And what I mean by that is it makes Arcane Missiles one of the most important abilities for the spec, specifically keeping 3 charges of Arcane Missiles for your windows of damage and then pouring them into massive damage during your Arcane Power. So the burst damage is probably better than any other spec, meaning that if you can stack CDs associated with Arcane Mage into a damage amplifying moment, Arcane Mage is going to do more damage than any other spec in the entire game for that burst window, which is kind of a cool niche. It's ahead of fire by actually a mile, guys, if you want to know the truth. And one of the best examples of this is if you watch how Touch of the Magi interacts with the Shades of Barghast in Altamore's fight. When you grip a Shade of Barghast in, if you Touch of the Magi that shade and then use Barrage with the legendary effect that Arcane has, when this hits Execute, it will convert all of that amplified damage into Touch of the Magi damage that will then hit Altamore. And so even though your details meters kind of read it incorrectly, when you go to the logs and when you do all the math correctly, you can see that essentially within that burst window, you can convert all of that damage into another splash damage onto other targets. So this is true for burst single target specifically, and though we may not have these kinds of damage amplifying moments in the next raid tier, it's true of Arcane in general that when you can stack all of those pieces together, your Touch of the Magi window within Arcane Power is substantial. Power infusion, if it's important, trinket uses, As I said before, though I don't think a lot of Arcane Mages are playing Venthyr, the kind of Nadia interactions, it's like those old trinkets where you got critical strike and then versatility back to back. Arcane made use of those in substantial ways. Though I don't know if the burst profile is going to be that significant. Arcane does scale with these things fairly well. The only other major thing to account for is that haste scaling does interact a little bit with Arcane Barrage, of course, but mostly with Arcane Missile's channel time, meaning if you have a bunch of haste, there's also the haste from Lust legendary that sometimes gets used, so you can get double benefit from Temporal Warp, and this is important for these burst windows as well. So anything that you can cram into your Arcane Power window for Arcane Mage is really important, and the reduction on Arcane Missile's cast time is influenced by haste, so that's why it's here as far as a secondary stat scaling. I don't think that Arcane's going to scale that well overall going into the next expansion, unless burst windows, that fit the Arcane Power profile are really important for raids progressing. I think Arcane will do fine. One of the problems is it has to compete with being not Frost and not Fire, both of which have their niches. Fire, of course, having execute-oriented damage. Although Arcane's Barrage execute damage is actually quite solid and probably close to Fire's, though most people don't realize this. It's still the problem of Arcane having to be stood still and being very precise with their movement, and that's a massive detriment, guys, in World First rating. The fact that you are forced to be stuck casting your abilities and you can't move is a huge deal, and it's usually a huge deal breaker between the differences between Arcane and Fire. Though I think Arcane will scale reasonably well. If you look at the logs, it actually is scaling in AoE in ways that are unbelievably good, and that's largely to do with the way that Arcane Barrage damage is improved due to that legendary. So still nothing wrong with Arcane. I just expect people will likely play Fire because of the burst window, though we can talk about the nerf to legendary next. Fire is one of the best examples of a spec that has what we would think of as traditional kind of scaling models, meaning there are so many passives and abilities that come together to scale this and make it quite a strong spec, and they almost are all associated with crit and mastery. Hot Streak, for example, scales with crit. Critical Mass scales. This is probably the premier secondary stat scaling in the game, meaning this is going to improve all of the other secondary stats that you have. That's why I have it marked out here in green. It's just scaling crit even more. Combustion obviously scales by converting crit into mastery. Fireball has a stacking crit chance associated with it if you do not receive a critical strike, so that's also going to scale based on our crit. All of these things are really cool, and Fire Mage has taken advantage of this throughout the ages, and even though it was quite bad in EP, it got the boost. Quite bad on paper in EP. What really propelled it was the fact that it could scale through the bracers and through our access to things like lucid dreams and other effects like that. Some really unique scaling opportunities with its fire blast, etc., etc. So Fire is no stranger to the kinds of crazy scaling that you can get by the end of an expansion, and I think this is kind of a cool thing. Kindling as a talent, this is the one that's kind of under Fire at the moment. It essentially allowed your combustion to be cooled down whenever you crit. This is also improved by haste. This was at 1.5 seconds of cooldown, which meant that you could get your combustion down to something like a minute, which was exceptional for a major CD, and most of Fire's damage is coming out of the combustion window. Awesome stuff. It got nerfed just recently in the PTR to 1 second, I believe, so we're likely looking at a 1.5 CD. Still probably okay, I'll be honest with you. Fire, with that kind of a nerf, it just means that Fire is going to be able to take advantage of other secondary stats to some degree, although crit might start to be a bit of a dead stat. Our mastery scales in really weird ways. It's exceptionally good in AoE, so Mythic Plus is pretty important. It's not actually that much of a burst AoE damage source, something like, for example, Barrage from Arcane to compare to another mage, which is a burst effect that's going to do a lot of damage. Or if you wanted the burst out of an Unholy DK, which is another good example to compare, you still need Ignite to tick, so it's really solid in high Mythic Plus because those mobs are going to burn down over, a couple of seconds rather than them being eliminated immediately. Most raid encounters that have significant AoE components don't have a long, component of stacked damage. Those stacked AoE moments tend to be bursted down. Any sort of large multi-target fights tend to be things that are cleaved down overall, and fire doesn't actually do very well at that. But the mastery is somewhat reasonable. But in single target especially, the value is so low, because what we're trying to do is, through haste, reduce the CD on combustion so that we can get more combustions off. So the value of crit and mastery largely are deflated because of all of the scaling that we get out of crit due to these effects and the fact that our mastery is not so significant in our single target. But just be aware that in AoE this flips around, as you can see here. All right, Frost Mage, probably the spec that I am anticipating will be the best scaler of single target or cleave damage alongside. I don't know about the best. Maybe behind Shadow Priest. What I have here, Shadow Priest and Feral Druid as some of the top ones, and maybe Affliction Warlock, although they got nerfed, so this data might be a little bit late. But Frost has some good scaling elements too. Obviously Shatter, which is a crit multi-scale, so it does 3 times the damage to shattered pieces. This means Ice Lance hits like a truck. They have a lot of haste scaling. So the Slick Ice legendary is the one that reduces the cast time and the damage of Frostbolt, and it's cumulative. So that these cumulative effects are kind of an interesting discussion for secondary stat scaling. Anytime you see cumulative stuff where something will get better, this is true of elemental shamans, for example. Whenever you use the elemental, the storm elemental, and that's going to reduce lightning bolt and chain lightning's cast time, it's similar stuff. It just means that haste actually gains in value in those circumstances because Frostbolt is so strong. And this is especially true of Frost Mages, guys, because they also have interaction with every single Frostbolt cast. Your Brain Freeze and your Fingers of Frost. So Brain Freeze is going to give us that ability to shatter a target, and Fingers of Frost is the one that gives us the free Ice Lances, which is the majority of our damage. These are both scaled off of Frostbolt hitting the target. So the more Frostbolts we cast, the better. Having the Slick Ice legendary means we have more casts and quicker casts of Frostbolt, and you can see where I'm going with this. Icy Veins also is a haste scaler. It's a 30% haste scaler, which is substantial. So these things are all make haste a really strong stat for Frost. And whenever haste is a really strong stat for a caster, you can be pretty sure that it's going to scale reasonably well into other expansions, because on-use haste trinkets are things that scale forward. The use of Bloodlust at specific times mean that these specs, even ones like Frost that are kind of steady specs over the course, gain a lot of value in those moments. Our mastery in single target is complete garbage as a Frost Mage because Frozen Orb damage is so low and our icicles are not that significant on the whole. It doesn't mean that mastery is not something that can be used. It just means that it doesn't scale very well in single target. This is not true of AoE, and our scaling in Cleave is kind of off the charts with the way that Shatter works with Ice Lances. So I anticipate actually Frost Mages being pretty solid going forward. The question will be whether a world first raid comp decides that the damage profile of Frost, which is sort of steady damage across an encounter with pretty solid cleave when things are stacked, is better than the on-demand burst from Fire Mages, assuming that Fire Mages can get enough haste to get the killing talent to work for them reasonably well. Frost is also going to make quite a good use of any crit or any specific amplification of their stats. So again, back to the Venthyr thing, the Nadia boost, it doesn't really matter. This is the same thing with Hyrmir in Necrolords. If you were playing that and you're playing the Necro Mage, which I don't think is very popular for Frost at the moment, but nevertheless, it's still, the gemstone crit that you're going to get. Those are great for different specs like Beastmaster and Frost that have a steady damage profile, because you don't really care when you get the stats, but just getting them is a good thing. So good news for Frost, I think, going forward. Windwalker. Okay, another spec that is kind of unusual in that it offers us a debuff, so there is potential for it to have a raid spot if Brewmaster is bad. There is your crit passive, which is scaling your crit, but other than that, there's no specific interactions in the kit that scale with crit. One note here, Invoker's Delight makes the value of haste even worse. It's the go-to legendary at the moment for Windwalkers. It's going to give you 33% haste whenever you press your Celestial. So in this case, our Tiger comes out as a 2-minute CD. We get 33% haste as an amp for our abilities. It just happens to be so much of an amplification that, at least the people I talk to in Windwalker, it makes it really the best one specifically for single target in any AoE scenarios. And that's largely due to the fact that we have such a dearth of haste in general for Windwalker. This has been true of them for a long time. And that's partly to do with the way the kit works. But in general, having on-demand 30% haste just tends to be better than any other major interaction, despite the fact that on the whole, Windwalker doesn't have a lot of interactions with haste that are beneficial. This fact, this legendary alone, is going to continue to make haste an undesirable stat going forward, so I think of haste as being almost always dead for Windwalkers based on that. The mastery does affect all damage, and there are a couple reasons why it makes mastery is actually not that good as a stat to scale for Windwalkers. Part of it is really to do with the borrowed power that Windwalker is experiencing currently in the game. In Kyrian especially, we have combat meditation, we have weapons of order, we have strike with clarity as the conduit, are all amplifications to our mastery specifically. And this is one of the specs that has a high degree of value in versatility due to the inflation of haste in the Invoker's Delight and the fact that mastery is getting stacked like crazy in our borrowed power, not actually in our base kit. This means that crit is quite high, but versatility is even more so an important stat for our Windwalker scaling. This is a bit of a problem. It means that at the moment, if things don't change, Windwalkers will likely be severely hamstrung on the secondary stat scaling side of things. It means whenever you have versatility as this important in your kit, there's going to be some problems with scaling just due to how much rating is soaked up by versatility on the whole. So it doesn't mean Windwalker will be bad. It just means that we hit a kind of problem of crit being good, versatility being good, our mastery being already taken care of, and haste being really bad. There's just really nowhere to go. They may be brought just due to the physical debuff to world first rating. I actually anticipate it will be, likely by limit, just because someone like Trill is so good at Windwalker, but I'm not sure. It depends on if Brewmaster is good. Retribution Paladins. Okay, so they have some scaling and haste. Art of War, which is our auto attacks. It's an RNG reset, so kind of like our Havoc Demon Hunters, there's some potential crazy scaling that goes on with haste here. We also get CDR for our Holy Power generators, meaning Crusader Strike, Hammer of Wrath, are all influenced by haste. They are reduced in their CDR. I think Blade of Justice is as well, meaning that any kind of builder spender that can take advantage of both the reduction in the global cooldown and also the CDR of their main builders is going to get a significant amount of value out of haste. They are in their profile largely a burst CD spec, and as far as the melees go, one of the best burst CD specs in the game. If you follow any PvP, you'll note that people groan a lot when they see Retribution Paladins because of this fact. They just run in Final Reckoning, Execution Sentence, blow you up with their Kyrian ability, and off they go. This is true for PvE as well, largely. 80% of their damage is mastery focused, which is pretty significant. A scaler, and they also have really good base scaling, so 13% with 0 rating, and 21 is not too bad per 1% point. This raises the value, in my opinion, of trinkets and amps that go together with Retribution, but it also means that their gameplay is a little bit flat, meaning you have high highs in your burst windows and wings, and you have low lows otherwise, because we have 0 other scaling modifiers in crit, and there's nothing that's specifically scaling our versatility or anything like that. I think they'll scale fairly well overall, just based on the fact that haste is one of their primary stats for scaling alongside mastery. You'll see actually a lot of the more significant logs have a lot more mastery than haste even. And this is a good sign overall for Retribution Paladins, I think. They have a couple of interesting niches in world first rating. If the problem is it's taken up usually also by your Holy Paladin, which has seen an insane amount of play due to the raw damage that they put out with Venthyr. But getting an immunity, getting another bop, perhaps having Devotion Aura if you are not playing Holy Paladin, is pretty substantial as a raid contribution. So from the melee slot, they do offer some interesting things. I don't know if that's enough for a World First Guild to consider them. Really, they would be looking at this damage profile of, do we need this burst damage right now from a melee slot, or can we get it somewhere else? Is it that significant for us to progress in these later bosses? Ret's looking like it'll be a really fun spec to play because it'll speed up as the expansion goes on, which is always good as well. Shadow Priest, this spec, if it goes unchecked, is, in my opinion, the spec most readily prepared to take advantage of secondary stats across the board. And there are some conditions to this, but and some caveats to this, but I think we can already see the evidence of this in some of our 95 percentile parses. These are without. By the way, when I did all this and looked through all of the Warcraft logs at specific bosses, I made sure to choose and evaluate a number of raid logs, for example, that do not have extensive power infusion use. So if you look at the logs right now, and if you looked at your Zymoxes, or if you wanted a burst profile and you looked at Sludge Fist, you would see a number of the top ones are making use of 3 or 4 external buffs in power infusion. Shadow Priest, it's even crazier. So you'll have I think 5 or 6 of the top logs have 6 or 7 Shadow Priests power infusioning them. Some of the logs I checked where the power infusion was being donated to other players in other portions still have Shadow as doing exceptional amounts of damage. And part of the reason is due to the way that the scaling works. So Shadowy Apparitions and Hungering Void as a talent, which is a common one used, both scale our crit, but they do it in a unique way. The Shadowy Apparitions will just send another occurrence. So it's sort of doubling the value of your crit rather than it being specifically tied to a resource generation or a chance to do X or Y. This just doubles the value of this specific interaction, and Hungering Void is similarly like that. Insanity generation from haste, this is kind of like the builder spender portion, is a significant scaling part of Shadow Priests. Hungering Void as a talent gives you more uptime. Mindbender's auto attack, which is a significant portion of your damage, and of course Power Infusion are all related to haste scaling. And then even though the kind of base amount from our mastery is not that significant, remember it's 4 times 3 because we have 3 dots that will be rolling. That's 12%, which is reasonable. The 70 to 1% is not that great, but again, we're multiplying by 3. It does affect all damage. It is conditional, but it is interacting with all of our damage. And here's the thing that makes Shadow Priest actually so scary as a scaler. We don't have very many examples of this, but Devouring Plague is a fairly unique spender. Almost every other spender that you see is based on some kind of snapshotted amount of your abilities or spells over time. If you look at Ret, for example, and our Templar's Verdict, which is also a really good spender and takes in our mastery significantly. It's just a 1 button. You have 3 holy power. You press your button, it converts it into an amount of damage in Templar's Verdict, and off you go. But Devouring Plague is sort of weird in that it's an ability that will roll over the damage of whatever previous Devouring Plague. It doesn't clip it, it doesn't eat it, it doesn't munch it, it just sends it into the next Devouring Plague on the target. This means that haste scaling can go off the charts for Shadow Priests because their main spender, which is Devouring Plague, will just continue to apply all of the damage. None of the damage is lost from using it. It also means that funneling is really significant for this class. So Shadow Priest dots are not that great at the moment. That's why you have a Boomkin in your raid to take care of waiters and those sorts of things. But what it does do is offer you resource generation that you then convert into Devouring Plagues on a target. And those Devouring Plagues never go to waste. This is compounded by the bizarre nature of Void Form, which is always going to extend your Devouring Plagues as you stay in Void Form. And because of the way we can cool it down with some of our abilities, you'll have high uptime on this ability, and it makes Devouring Plague really, really strong. So you don't have to worry about the same kinds of dot windows that most other dot classes have and the pandemic nature of it. It's just always good to press Devouring Plague, and it scales really, really well. So I anticipate, if there's no changes, that Shadow Priest will be an exceptional ranged class. It's going to scale very well with haste. Obviously, in 2-target cleave, the cleave portion of it isn't that good necessarily, but the ability for you to, at ranged, generate a really special form of funneling on a single target is pretty awesome. It also has pretty good burst in single target as well. If you were looking for a spec to play that's going to scale well with secondary stats, I would point you to Shadow Priest, probably as the premier spec. Okay, on to the rogues. Rogues are kind of unique because of the nature of slice and dice, but let's kind of work through them, each of them and all the scaling that they have, and talk about that at length as we go forward. So Seal Fate obviously is a crit modifier for our Assassination Rogues. It's going to give us more combo points, which is actually a significant scaler of our ability, because Assassination is quite a slow spec, meaning that you're going to have open GCDs oftentimes, and you're going to be pooling resources at different times to do a lot of burst damage within certain windows. Seal Fate has a direct correlation with the amount of combo points you generate, and therefore the amount of Envenoms that you can produce. And in single target, guys, Envenom is king. It does tons and tons of damage, and it's going to amplify our ability. Assassination, actually, for the record, in my opinion, is the second best scaling spec after Shadow, and potentially after Affliction Warlock, although I think Affliction's getting nerfed on Malefic Rapture, so Assassination might, in my opinion, have moved up in that regard. And it has, in my opinion, also exceptional cleave if you can stay on 2 or 3 targets, especially 3 targets. But if the targets are all the way off on the other side of the map and you have to keep moving, you'll lose a little bit of value, but they're still quite strong. There's also scaling in Flagellation, which is a haste scaler in our Venthyr Covenant. And specifically, this is why it's a good pooling or a good funnel spec. Venomous Wounds is energy regeneration. Deadly Poison plus Envenom are also associated with haste. Slice and Dice, and here I've noted it for all 3 specs here in Assassination, is an unusual scaler because it's scaling our auto attack specifically, so the amount of times we hit things, and this amplifies haste without incurring kind of the normal DR that we associated with haste. What this means, largely, guys, is that Assassination is going to have a really high auto attack damage due to the way all of these things interact, and also that Envenom is going to get a lot of value if you can have your bleeds up and Venomous Wounds running on other targets. Our Mastery doesn't scale exceptionally well. It's mostly bleed and poison damage, but it's still kind of irrelevant given how much this spec scales with extra haste. This is important too to consider when you think of a spec that's really slow. So the incoming combo point generation and the threshold of energy regeneration, when these things are low at the beginning of an expansion, your spec's going to feel really clunky. This is true of Arms Warrior as well. But if haste is a significant scaler, as it is with Assassination, by the end of the expansion, when you have tons of that resource, so haste, if you have any other modifiers, things that interact with other secondary stats like we have with Seal Fate and Crit, this spec is going to be bonkers unless things change. So I think, like Shadow Priest, Assassination is in a really good spot due to the way it scales. You have to stay on target though, because your auto attacks are a significant portion of your damage. So this will be the real skill, is making sure that your rogues understand that the secondary stats are really valuable only when we can be on target and pressing in venom. It's a pretty cool spec. If you haven't played Assassination yet, it's set to be really strong. I should also mention that Zoldikes, from a world first rating point of view, is an interesting legendary because it's an execute. So I haven't put it in here because it's not quite as significant a raid utility portion, but often world first raiders will look for specs to have an execute. So if people are humming and hawing about bringing an Assassination Rogue, they do have access to Zoldikes, and even though poison and bleeds aren't a significant portion of your damage, within execute there's a reasonable addition there. So obviously rogues of all stripes bring lots of utility on the personal side. They're just really durable, one of the most durable due to feint and due to the way that cheat death can destroy mechanics and all this kind of stuff. They have cloak, they have step, or the equivalent. Always a good addition, but you do take up a melee slot. Outlaw, Between the Eyes has crit scaling. Otherwise, we have haste scaling with slice and dice like Assassination, combat potency, which is energy regeneration from your offhand attacks. Your restless blades and roll the bone cooldown reduction is also associated with haste, which is interesting. Obviously, combat is a kind of a bizarre spec in that roll the bones is going to govern a lot of the outcomes, and in single target that makes it kind of a really chaotic spec to try to track as far as secondary stat valuations. But in general, what a lot of the main features of Roll the Bones, which is going to give you a bunch of different interactions with your kit, is largely the main ones are the ones that are going to cool down all of your main abilities, like our Adrenaline Rush, like the what is it, Killing Spree, I think is the other major one that gets cooled down, and other things as well. And I guess there's interaction with Marked for Death as well if you take that talent. I'm not sure if that's in vogue at the moment, but we used to do it a lot in BFA. In any case, Outlaw's a really fun spec to play, but it's super chaotic. And as far as secondary stats are concerned, what haste offers you above and beyond the other two stats is pretty significant. And it's so important, actually, that generally speaking, the value of crit and mastery go way down compared to haste. What I would say, and this is true for subtlety as well, and this is why I've marked them off in blue, is that there's maybe a disproportionate emphasis in the way Blizzard designed these classes for mastery. They have a really high base rate, so 18% at 0 rating, and they have fairly significant scaling, especially subtlety, which is only 14.28 rating per 1%. But the value that you get out of these is so low. Main gauche, which is just your left hand, or the energy that you gain and the additional damage that you gain from your offhand proccing, is around 15% of your damage. It's pretty low. It's sometimes even lower actually in Outlaw. So the value of mastery is so low compared to what this spec actually does, that it's unfortunately kind of a dead stat. It just means versatility is usually pretty good for Outlaw. Between the Eyes it really depends. It's kind of RNG related because it's a huge crit amp, but Between the Eyes is only good under certain roll the bone conditions, so just be aware. But Outlaw will always be a really good Mythic Plus spec, just as an aside. It's largely not going to be a very good raid spec due to the chaotic nature of it, due to the way sometimes things like Killing Spree put your character in really weird positions, and the fact that if you need a rogue, Assassination is, generally speaking, the damage profile you're looking for. There are some good burst moments from Outlaw, but it really is RNG related. You have to get good roll of bones, etc., etc. Subtlety. So Backstab has some crit scaling, meaning when you backstab, you have some valuation. I think it's combo point related. I'll have to go back and double check that. Obviously, Symbols of Death is anti-synergistic because it gives you an automatic crit on your next ability, which is a problem for crit scaling, but on the whole, it's okay to have a bit of crit for subtlety. Again, you have in haste, slice and dice, and shadow techniques, which is going to scale energy and combo point generation, both of them, which is quite significant for subtlety. This has been true for quite a while now. I think there was, what was the raid when Subtlety was one of the premier funneling, and they nerfed it. But I remember there's that one fight. It wasn't Gahoon. It was another one of the fights in the raid, in the later parts of that raid, where you could just fan of knives and convert all of it into some insane single target burst damage. That has been kind of removed, and I think if you look at the way our mastery functions, as I just mentioned, it looks like a kind of shadow of those days when mastery was actually significant because of how we could funnel. But outside of that, I think subtlety falls a little bit behind due to the way this mastery scales. Versatility is quite strong, and we have this unfortunate part of Symbols of Death being kind of anti-synergistic in crit. I don't see subtlety scaling very well in PvE raids going forward. Even though their auto attack damage is a high representation and they have some haste interactions, I don't think it has quite the same oomph as assassination as a secondary secondary scaling class. Interestingly, we haven't talked a lot about enhancement yet, but we will when we get there. Subtlety does get some value, like Arms Warrior, from Wind Fury Totem due to the way that Shadow Techniques works, but I don't see it as being a prominent spec in World First Rating. Okay, we're almost there, guys. Elemental. So I have Elemental Blast, EB, written here for all three of your secondary scalers because it actually scales things in interesting ways. It's a really prominent portion of both elemental and enhancement, and it's probably one of the reasons that makes specifically these two classes quite strong as secondary stat monsters. Both of these specs, guys, are up there. They're kind of off the wall specs as far as World First Raiders are concerned, but they're pretty close. They're right underneath, in my opinion, Shadow and Assassination as far as making use of all the different secondary stats. There's one caveat to that for Elemental, which is Critical Strike. Lava Burst has an anti-synergy in that it's always going to crit when it hits our Flame Shock targets, which is pretty solid. But there is the other portion of that, which means that Elemental Fury, which is going to convert all of our critical strikes from 200% to 250%, which is quite strong, and it's dramatically good for either the EOTGS legendary, the Echoes of the Great Sundering, which is the Earthquake legendary, so you Earth Shock, and then your next Earthquake gets buffed, and especially in Cleave and Mythic Plus, so AoE. So the value of crit goes up for elementals significantly as a scaling modifier whenever we're in Cleave or especially AoE. It's actually got some of the best on-demand, sustained, burst both sides of the coin, AoE damage, and you can see this in Mythic Plus. The problem is, of course, in Mythic Plus, nothing stands in your Earthquake for long enough because tanks have had to kite for quite a long time. But that's an aside. If you had a moment where you needed 3 or 4 seconds of insane AoE damage, Elemental actually has the goods, not just the overloads from Chain Lightnings in Stormkeeper, but also Echoes of the Great Sundering. They're also pretty decent at Cleave and have okay funnel. It's not actually that good because of the CD of Flame Shock, but if your fire elementals out, you can get some reasonable funnel depending on the legendary that we're using. The one that allows us to get a free proc of Lava Burst off of our Earth Shocks is pretty good when we have another target to have a Flame Shock up on, because it just means we're going to have a few more interactions with our haste, and that's where we turn next. Lava Surge obviously is going to make our Flame Shocks proc an additional free Lava Burst that we can cast. This has been a mainstay of Elemental for a long time, and haste scaling is quite good because Lava Burst is a builder into our spenders. There's been a bit of a realignment of the damage profile of Elemental, where the damage is kind of a little bit more loaded into our builders than it ought to be, and this is and then it was pushed back into our spenders and back and forth. This is what makes Mastery a kind of bizarre one for Elemental, but on the whole, Mastery is not too great in single target. It gets better in AoE because Chain Lightning value is okay for building into Earthquakes and so on and so forth. But one of the problems is that our Mastery only really impacts our builders, our Lightning Bolts, and our Lava Burst. Now this is okay because you know, subsequent mastery procs that produce another occurrence of the spell still give us some Maelstrom, which builds towards our Earth Shock or our Earthquake, but largely, you know, the value isn't quite there. There is some DR because it's a static effect, meaning you either get a reoccurrence, an overload of Lightning Bolt, or you don't. And that means that Mastery is not necessarily a stat that scales too well in single target. Elemental is actually still a pumper in single target, despite the fact that there are some awkward scaling moments with Mastery. And that has in part to do with the way that Elemental Blast works. It scales things dynamically, and it has to do with the fact that Elemental Fury is quite strong even in single target. So Haste, an awesome stat. Versatility, pretty solid stat for Elemental, not quite to the same degree as a problem as something like Havoc DH, which I think we talked about, and you know, where versatility is so important, but still Elemental's in a good spot. I don't think it scales quite as good as Enhancement personally, and I'll talk about that in a second. But that's partly to do with the way Wind Fury scales other classes as well, potentially. But Elemental's still strong. The question will be for World First Raiders whether they need a class that offers the kind of AoE damage that Elemental is good at, or if it's going to stick it out in these kind of cleave moments. Again, the funneling is not quite as strong as something like Shadow or Boomkin, or specifically Affliction Warlock. So it remains to be seen whether Elemental will get a spot in World First Rating. It offers really no significant buffs to the raid, so there's that problem. Although they are pretty durable. If you look at the way the Earth Elemental works for Elemental Shaman, you get a massive bonus to your max HP. You can also put this together with Necrolord, which is kind of subpar as a Covenant, but you still get the Fleshcraft shield, and Elemental can make use of that to keep them a little more durable. They don't have an immunity, but there is some sense of them just being a little more sturdy this time around. All right, Enhancement Shaman. Obviously, Elemental Blast is here, and it's doing its scaling thing across all three major pieces. Enhancement is a bizarre duck. It's been changed so many times, but it has significant scaling in haste especially, and its mastery is, in my opinion, one of the ones that's potentially off the charts, given that the flat amount at 16% buffs all of the relevant damage, fire, frost, and nature, and it also buffs our chance to get Stormbringer and Wind Fury procs, which makes it a little bit bizarre. And this amount is kind of low, but it still makes for a really strong kit, even if you're doing some of the Lavalash shenanigans, which can be pretty strong. But let's look at the haste scaling. First of all, Wind Fury, which is an ability that procs main hand attacks to reoccur on your target. There's some talents that interact with this as well. There's also scaling with Hot Hands, specifically with haste, and the Witch Doctor legendary, or the Doomwinds legendary are both relevant for haste scaling because they're associated with the auto attacks of your dogs or with your Doomwinds when you drop the totem down. So lots of Wind Fury scaling and Wind Fury totem scaling, which is going to improve not just your own auto attack damage and Wind Fury procs, but also that of your party members. So there's some relevance for a spot, although Enhancement is going to have the problem of being a melee spec that needs to find a spot. If you have, like, for example, a lot of single target execute moments where Arms Warrior is just really important, they get a lot of rage generation. Actually, they get all of their rage generation from auto attacks, and so they're like one of the prime candidates for a Wind Fury totem. So if you had a group of 4 Venthyr Arms Warriors ready to rock and roll in high pushing circumstances where you needed execute damage, everyone was tuned toward that. You actually might want an Enhanced Shaman just to increase their damage, because it'll push it to something like 8%, maybe 7 to 8%. I forget what the data was on that. In any case, Wind Fury Totem's a little bit unique, but I think Enhancement Shaman just makes use of all stats fairly reasonably well, and the fact that it scales, especially these 2 legendaries, and that the mastery is such a strong base scaler, means that they're really a ripe class to make use of all of these secondary stats alongside the use of Blast. Elemental Blast being something that scales things out of control. Good spec. Probably won't see world first race unless there's unique circumstances for it. Its single target will be off the charts by the end of the next tier due to the way that scaling works, in my opinion. Okay, on to Warlocks. Warlocks are a bizarre bunch. As I just mentioned, Affliction got nerfed on Malefic Rapture specifically. They have some... they're a bizarre bunch because you almost always have to have one of them due to the way that Lock Rocks are a vital part of World First Rating, and sometimes Warlock Gates are an important part of that too. But also because there's usually one Warlock spec that is tops at some portion. It's generally speaking either Affliction or Destruction, depending on the needs. That is to say, either single target or some sort of special dotting. Historically, Affliction's been excellent for. Or if you needed, Havoc windows, Destruction was there. But let's dive into Affliction first. Obviously, there's no specific crit scaling in Affliction. It is a dot-based class, meaning that haste has some relevant scaling for it, but there's nothing within the kit that scales it outside of resource-based generation. And like our assassination friends, Affliction at the moment has a kind of slow generation, meaning you don't get a lot of soul shards from your basic stuff, so you're getting out your unstable afflictions, and those cost soul shards, but also Malefic Rapture, which is your main soul shard spender. But they don't come back like a Fury Warrior, just tons of rage spent, tons of rage spent. Instead, you have a slow building. That means that haste actually has quite a lot of value overall, because as you increase haste in this generation, you'll get to use more of these heavy hitting abilities. And I think Blizzard saw this with the way Malefic Rapture is working, and the fact that Affliction's dots are better than Shadow Priests, if a little bit worse than Boomkins, and their scaling on multiple targets is going to be off the charts. So they tuned back Malefic Rapture, which was your main spender in that regard. But Mastery, guys, is still a really strong stat for Affliction. It's 65 to 70% of our damage, and in some cases a little bit higher, because it impacts both Malefic Rapture and all of our dots. It has a really, really high base. I think it might be, I'll just check here really quickly. It looks to me like it's the highest flat base. Unholy's pretty close. And Subtlety is right there too. And obviously, a few of these other classes are up there as well. But 20% for having 0 rating is substantial. And the fact that it has such a low rating per 1% means that Mastery is always going to be good. And you can scale Mastery up through the rest of the expansion. It'll be solid. So these two factors, guys, even though it doesn't have a specific crit interaction, and it doesn't really have a specific haste interaction other than with your dots, means that this spec is going to scale well no matter what you do. And I think Blizzard saw this and they're like, we have to stop this. Guys, I think Affliction will be a monster unless they tune it. If not by the end of this next raid tier, certainly by the one that follows, because they're likely to input things like, the Venthyr stats that you just get, and then there's likely to be fights where you have ads that you can dot up and forget about and just gain resources from, either to pile a bunch of damage like our Shadow Priests through Devouring Plague, or Malefic Rapture a couple of targets or whatever. But there's likely to be things that are hanging around and need to be killed kind of over time. Affliction has always been good at that, and you can see here with the way that Mastery scales, it's going to continue to be like that. It also has a pretty good single target burst profile, although with the Malefic Rapture nerf, maybe that's not going to be as good. Just the way Dark Glare works, the way Rapture is converting all of your dot damage into, that much more damage. But I think largely, and this was made, I think I finished all of this stuff before the PTR came out, which is unfortunate, but I think it's going to be a better Cleave spec overall, and that Shadow Priest will take over definitively on the single target side as far as scaling goes, just because the Malefic Rapture nerfs are pretty substantial. Okay, Demo. Demo has no specific crit interactions. It is a builder spender, so there is some value in haste, kind of like your Retribution Paladin style, where you are constantly hitting buttons to build and spend pretty quickly. It also influences your pet's attacks, which is both the bolts that our wild imps are firing off, are also our summoned pets like Vile Fiend and the extra Felguard and our normal Felguard that we have running around. And finally, our Demonic Tyrant, which is our basic damage profile right there. So I think Tyrant accounts for quite a lot of our damage if we're using the Consumption Talon, which most people are in single target. And Demonology turns out to be, guys, quite a single target monster just based on this haste scaling alone. 90% of our damage is pet damage, which is significant, even though our mastery doesn't scale it that good. Our base amount is relatively low tuned, and the over percentage from 24.14 is not substantial. All this means, guys, is that mastery is still going to be quite a strong stat. Even though we don't have really any interest in going towards crit, the haste scaling is also substantial due to pet attack damage. So if you needed no funneling, no multi-target swapping, and your pets could easily move around, or you have a stationary boss, Demo is going to overtake Affliction in single target. Oftentimes, Demo is not that great because target swapping is awkward for pets. They don't have the UI, or the AI, I should say, to interact in quite the same way. Your wild imps will still fire a couple bolts off or fire one or two before they swap targets. Same thing for your Tyrant. If you have ever seen demo locks in arenas, for example, it's one of the most frustrating things. They'll be in the middle of the arena firing at a target. The guy just steps out of line of sight, and the Tyrant's damage is largely mitigated. So it's things like that that can sometimes occur also in a PvE scenario, but demo single target is quite strong at the moment, guys, and it looks like, based on how much mastery influences our damage, that haste and mastery are going to be good scalers. Destro. Okay, Destro is in an unusual situation in that it is, of all three, aside from Affliction's base mastery scaling, it's probably positioned well to scale really good for the following expansions. We have Incinerate damage and Immolate ticks have a chance to produce more soul shards, so double the effective soul shards they normally generate, which is pretty important synergy for Destruction Warlocks. Obviously, there's no specific haste scaling, though. Warlocks do have some talents that interact with haste, like Reverse Entropy and the way in which Conflagate reduces the cast time of your Incinerating Chaos Bolts, both kind of important portions. There's some legendaries that, of course, smooth that out even more for Conflagate, but there's others that push you a little bit more towards haste. I think it's Wilfred's gives you your Infernal back, so there's kind of a couple of builds that might be viable going forward that have some haste scaling, but not really true haste scaling in the same sense as some of the other builds. They have pretty reasonable mastery, in part because it's split into two forms. You have your base mastery, which starts at 8 with 0 rating, but then there's sort of a secondary portion, so it's 8% plus some a random number between 1 and 8 for every different damage occurrence that you do. So your Chaos Bolt might hit for 8% mastery, or it might hit and do 14 or 15% mastery having been applied to that Chaos Bolt. So it's the theme of chaotic damage, and on the whole, it ends up being a pretty solid stat for destruction. Nothing over the top. Obviously, we really like haste, but still solid. The big benefit here is that it affects all of our damage, so it's always in play. On the secondary portion, actually, I think Mastery also reduces your damage taken for destruction, which is kind of unique. I don't know if that makes them as tanky as Demonology overall, because Demo's got the increased synergy with their pet, I believe it is, where the pet takes up to 20% of the every single piece of damage that they take, and there's that synergy there. But Destro's still kind of tanky. The point here, of course, is that Destro is really good at Cleave, and it looks like, given how they scale with both crit, and how naturally, as a slower builder spender like its cousin Affliction, over time as you get a lot more haste, these things smooth out even more, and you can fit more of your resources into to important windows. The cleave damage can get off the charts. If Wilfred's becomes a serious thing, then haste scales even better, I guess, because you get more infernals coming during your infernal CD. So that's with Reign of Chaos as a talent, and you might take Soul Conduit, but more likely you're going to pair that up with your Dark Soul. Destruction Warlock probably won't scale as hard on the single target as Affliction is poised to, but anything with multiple targets, guys, one of the things that's interesting about Destruction is it has the ability to sort of funnel and multi-dot as well, though we don't have the same scaling of damage like we did at the end of BFA, where your Chaos Bolts are tied to your Infernal so that you could build up the damage profile of your Chaos Bolt over the course of your Infernal, and then be just launching massive bombs, coupling that together with Havoc right at the end of the window to make for really destructive Cleave. We don't have that quite to the same degree. Your Cleave is actually tied a little bit more to your Infernal itself, and then just whatever you can fit into your Havoc windows with your normal Chaos Bolts. But as we saw in the PTR, if Destruction gets buffs to Chaos Bolt in particular, it can perhaps run away with scaling, because the generation through crit that's associated with this scaling, the increased haste that's going to allow you to generate quicker, it only makes this spec better and better. So I'm imagining we'll see some world first in the next tier with at least one Destruction Warlock if Affliction does fall off. Okay, on to our warriors. So first up is Arms Warrior. And Arms is a kind of unique duck. It's a little bit like Assassination in that it's a slow spec with open GCDs at different points, depending on the talent selection that you choose. And it has the following synergies. So your auto attack crits end up generating you more rage, which is a fairly substantial scaling synergy for Arms, because the only way for you to generate rage is by auto attacking. What this means is, ultimately, if you're playing, in a Cleave scenario, Arms Warrior is going to gain a lot of value if it can crit these targets and convert all of that rage into sweeping strike damage. If you're Venthyr at both ends of the spectrum, so the top portion of your target or at the bottom in execute. But the crit synergy is actually quite strong, and it makes Arms scaling really, really important, because it's the only way to generate your resources. Obviously connected to that is haste, so if melee attacks are the thing that help us generate rage and crit gives us more, hitting more often is obviously significant. And again, as a slow spec, what we see often with these specs, they scale potentially out of control if they're not addressed in later stages of an expansion, because you just get so much more haste as a stat from your gear. In addition to this, Tactician is a sort of low percent chance per rage spent to generate a random proc of Overpower. Overpower, both buffs are Mortal Strike, which is in general one of the largest hitting abilities for Arms, but it's also an important filler for the rotation, so that while you're waiting for Mortal Strike to come back off CD, and so that you don't spend all your rage by hitting Slam, your Overpower is used to bridge the gap. And this is especially true in execute phases, because unlike Fury, Arms has an uncapped execute. There's no CD to it, so you could essentially press it as many times as you have rage, and there's a rage reduction that's associated with Arms execute. You get 20 rage back if you don't kill the target. What Overpower does here is helps you fill the gap so that you can continue to execute with as much rage as possible, and continue to pump out a lot of damage in that most important part of almost every single end boss, the execute phase. So the fact that Tactician is also tied to our haste, meaning our attacks and our rage spent is going to generate Overpower, is an important kind of synergy here. Mastery is interesting for Arms. It used to be a dot, and it still retains that flavor a little bit, Deep Wounds that is, but it's actually the most important part of it is the debuff that you're receiving. Arms has pretty good mastery scaling, meaning like when you hit Mortal Strike or you hit Crusader Colossus Smash, excuse me, your target is going to receive a debuff for a certain window of time, and that's actually snapshot on the target. So if it runs out, it retains whatever level of mastery you had at the time. There's not really any reason to play around this at the moment in arms, unless you're maybe doing some really bizarre memes with Necrolord, where you have the banner out to give you more mastery. Maybe you're getting another banner from somebody else. You have a huge boost of mastery, and then you Mortal Strike, where you Colossus Smash the ad or the mob or the boss. They receive some kind of crazy multiplier on your damage. Maybe it's 50%, 60%. And then for that window of time during deep wounds, all your abilities are going to hit that much more hard. But if you Mortal Strike outside of that mastery bonus window, it'll reset the debuff to whatever your mastery is in that moment. So hard to play around given that we don't have a lot of extra abilities to press during that kind of a window, but it's still not irrelevant. This is a hard thing to keep up, the debuff on more than 2 targets. Deep wounds is only really applied in your Colossus Smash windows or during Mortal Strike, which has a CD. That is affected by haste, so that's kind of important to note. But it's just difficult to sweeping strikes, multiple targets, and a target moves away. How do you retain the debuff on it when you get back to it? You're generally speaking a single target monster, or in Cleaves that'll stick around to retain the debuff. That's where Mastery will scale things fairly well. I guess we get it also from Bladestorm as well. I should have mentioned that. But the point is that, generally speaking, the way ARMS plays right now, if you're doing Signet or if you're doing other kinds of shenanigans, Mastery's value is mostly in the fact that you just get whatever percentage as a bonus on top. So it's a good scaling stat because it affects all of our damage, and we can have 100% uptime on one target especially, but not as important as crit for scaling our rage generation, and melee's attacks obviously the same way. So we see a lot of haste crit within ARMS builds, and it should scale fairly well, especially if execute is an important mechanic for your guild's progress. Like, for example, Denathrius is a good test case for ARMS warriors, not because of Phase 1, and maybe even less so because of Phase 2, but largely because you spend so much time in Phase 3 killing that boss, and it's in an execute phase. So ARMS just is an exceptional spec at that moment, and it just happened to be that in Castle Nathria, that was one of the most important moments because it's the last boss. So if you'd had that effect on something like Shriekwing, probably ARMS wouldn't have seen that much value, and maybe even, I'm not totally sure how the World First race broke down, but I'm imagining that there was at least some consideration given to ARMS for Denathrius for that reason. In general, obviously, warriors are a good class, not only for the execute value, which ARMS is better than Fury, but Fury is still somewhat decent, but that which is kind of raid utility on its own, but also because of Shout, so you're bolstering health by 15% on both ends, so you get max HP and you get current HP, which is a lifesaver in so many instances. Just a nice raid CD to have in general, and it's one of the reasons why if you're going to take a melee class, it's very likely that you'll take one form of warrior or another. You might even take prot if you really think execute's important, because prot tank damage was pretty good and should scale very well into the next expansion. But 2-target cleave is kind of like Destruction Warrior. ARMS is probably the king of that if it's stacked, especially if you can get it in execute range. So either for Venthirs at both ends, or just with other things at the very end if you have a lot of time in execute. Fury. Fury's damage profile makes it usually a little better than ARMS. So if you look at logs in 95th percentile, often Fury is ahead on a number of the fights in Nathria, and I anticipate that'll be the same going forward. And that's just because it's a spec that is, able to make use of the Venthir execute a little bit more regularly. It has sort of better synergies overall with Signet, which is a legendary that has powered up your stuff, giving you recklessness, giving you Avatar, I believe, and also Bladestorm whenever you press one of the other ones. But here's the scaling that makes Fury interesting going forward. Obviously, recklessness is a button you press for 20% crit, and that's always just a handy thing to have. There's no other sort of major critical strike pieces built into the kit, but having an extra 20% crit with your major CD is a significant, kind of like balanced druids. It's a significant boost at the beginning of the next pack. It'll probably scale moderately well going into the next tier, and it allows you, if you wanted to, focus on other portions of your kit without knowing that crit's probably fine, but just nice to have that amp. Whenever you're enraged, which is an interesting element to mastery as well for Fury, you automatically gain 15% increased haste, which is massive. It's massive for a couple reasons. It's not an explosive amount of haste. Obviously, haste is really good for Fury, but auto attacks. It increases rage generation. It allows us to cool down some of our abilities like Bloodthirst faster, that kind of stuff. But just also getting on top of this 15% increased haste means that we're always going to be scaling this stat really well without it being cumbersome. Like that, if Enrage gave us 40% haste, we just would never want to have any on our gear, and it would make it problematic for scaling. But this is just a nice midway amount. And then, of course, being enraged, which we are for a substantial amount of time in a boss fight, and you can game this with rampages and all that kind of stuff, is significant, because it affects all of our damage. And this is regardless of whether we have deep wounds on the target, so it's a little bit different than arms in that regard. So mastery is somewhat solid. It's a little bit low on the numbers, but it's still just a great stat. I think in general, Fury really likes lots of different stats. It's a pretty consistent spec. It's got pretty useful AoE if you need it on demand. With I think it's the way Meat Grinder works with rampages and all of your other abilities, and Whirlwind, all putting together to have some pretty solid burst AoE. And my guess is, unless there's significant moments where Arms is pulling ahead on some fight that needs execute, or there's special cleave moments, my guess is that there'll be at least 1 or 2 Fury Warriors representing for that raid buff and the execute damage, just in general. I don't know if Arms and Fury are going to scale quite as hard as Shadow Priest, for example, or Assassination Rogue, but I do anticipate that just the World First people will think that this raid buff is worth your time. Now, we've kind of come to the end, and that was a long little bit to work through. What I want to stress here, guys, is not that I'm trying to make comments about which class I think is going to be better or worse, but to really show you that these are the features of each of the specs that contribute to a discussion about secondary stats scaling. And in some cases, it can be slightly detrimental, so specs have to focus a great deal of attention min-maxing 1 or 2 stats that might be inefficient. In most cases, the scaling within each of the kits is going to help it as an expansion goes forward. I was maybe a little bit of a downer on our hunters, for example, when maybe this needs a little more clarification, and you might find that as you heard this conversation, you thought, oh, well, this spec, he didn't really talk too much about that, or I think he's wrong with this. So please let me know in the comments your thoughts about secondary stats scaling. But I wanted to at least bring some information so you can see some data collected to show you what the specific interactions are, so that if people are talking to you about this class scales and this class doesn't scale, you have some frame of reference for talking about actual numbers, especially when it comes to mastery and specific interactions, things like critical mass, or how I-beam is an automatic crit and how it devalues things, or shadow apparitions being a doubling down on crit. These sorts of things are useful for the conversation, so that you can be aware of how to build your character and what kinds of niches are going to be useful for you overall. I hope you enjoyed this video, and please, again, leave comments below for me, and I'll try to get to them as I can. Thank you very much, and we'll catch you guys again